Warning: tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, time for video 2 of this little short series showing you how I am redoing the wiring on my 300B amplifier as I'm readying myself to start producing these things. This was a custom ordered one. Guy wanted the high-end FC30 3.5 S2 ISO Tango transformers, but then they also wanted the standard kind of chassis to try to bring the price down out of the range that they couldn't afford, make it affordable for them. So that's what we're doing. And this was a good prep for figuring out the wiring layout for my base model 300B, which from like here over is going to be identical. So it's really given me a kind of a head start on doing the prototyping of that amp. And that's what we've been doing here. I've had to move tag strips around and, sometimes sit there and just look at things for 20 or 30 minutes trying to figure out, like, okay, where's the best place to put this? And, what if I move to here kind of scenarios? And it's just a time-consuming thing doing the first one, trying to figure out where everything's going to go. And I've learned a lot since I built the first 300B amp about what's mandatory, what you need to do, what's overkill, what's not necessary, what works well, what sounds good, and all that sort of thing. And we're incorporating the years of trial and error on some of this stuff to get to this point. And it's one reason that I really struggled with making a production, kind of a lower price point 300B amp. Was the first one I built was so complex inside, I just didn't see any way of doing it that wasn't going to be really expensive and time consuming for me. And so some of this is simplifying the wiring in the build process without sacrificing any of the sonic goodness that the amp has. And I think we're accomplishing that. So in this video, we're going to get the front end wired up, which, isn't done yet. And then I'm going to show you the difference between the earlier amp and this version, and you'll, I think, easily be able to see how much less complex this is inside. And I've learned how to combine some of the grounding elements together in a way that makes sense, and be able to keep the front end separate from the output section, but not having to run wires just all over the inside of the amp like I did on the original one. So hopefully you'll enjoy this, and let's get busy putting the front end together on this amp. Okay, so today we're going to talk about how we're wiring up these front end tubes here, and the end tag strip here is grounded over to our star ground point over here in this amplifier. And then here are the 6.3 volt heaters. They connect to these two terminals here. This little rectifier bridge and cap go over to the LED on our power switch, like we do on most of our amps. And then this is the voltage divider that lifts the center tap for the 6.3 volt up to somewhere between 45 and 50 volts. It's not super critical, but somewhere around halfway to the 90 volts that we're going to see on the cathode of the upper stage of the cascode. Okay, so the heaters are going to run a twisted pair of wires. They're going to come down, go along here, then go under this ground wire down here in the corner, and then across and come up to this tube, and then come up to this tube. So let's zoom in here and look at the wiring on these driver tubes. So this terminal right here is where the B plus is going to connect on this tag strip and this one here. The centers of these tag strips with the mounting screws aren't attached to anything. They're just folded over and soldered to themselves and act as a mount point. Same on this over here. You can see we got the mount. Then we got 3 terminals, and then we got a 5 terminal strip here that the center point is not connected to anything. And then we got these 2 terminals and these 2 terminals. So the B plus is going to come from, let me scoot up here and show you. We're going to pull it off of the rail that's going to the output transformers. That's after the second stage of filtering. So it'll be this terminal and this terminal. Each channel has its own rail of power supply. So these are going to run down here and to this terminal and this terminal. Here we have our 4.7K filter dropping resistor. Goes over to this terminal here. Did the same thing on this channel. And then across these 2 terminals, we're going to have a filter cap. This is the decoupling filter network that goes between the B plus, the output transformer, and the plate of the driver tube or the cascode. And this cap, when we're all done wiring up the rest of the stuff, one of them's going to sit right there, and then the other one's going to sit right there. And this is grounded. There's a ground wire that goes from here to here. So this is the ground point for one channel. This is the ground point for the other channel. We also have a ground wire that runs from here to this center terminal. And then I left the cap and some stuff off this so you can kind of see how this is being wired. And then we have another ground wire that runs from here to the center of this tag strip right here, which is the ground point for the signal and the grid leak resistor and all this stuff over here. So let me kind of go over the components. We'll go ahead and leave this cap here for now just so you can kind of have a reference for what's going on here. So the B plus comes here. Then it goes to this 4.7K to this terminal, which is connected to this cap to ground. This is the 47K resistor for the upper triode in our cascode. Then we have this wire here that goes from the lower point of this tag strip up to this terminal, which is the plate of one of the triodes. This is the grid of the upper triode that acts like a screen in a pentode. And I'll go over that more in another video explaining how a cascode works. But basically though, plate connects here. So we got the plate load resistor to the plate. The cathode of the upper triode connects to the plate of the lower triode with this jumper wire across here. This is the grid stopper for the lower triode. So this is where the audio signal will come in. And then, like I said, this is a 1K grid stopper to the grid of the lower triode. Here's our grid leak resistor, which is a 1 mag, which is here in case the volume pot wiper goes open, that the grid of this tube always has a reference to ground. So this is the cathode. So we have grid, plate, cathode. The cathode has this 200 ohm resistor to this point on this tag strip. And then we're going to put our red LED from here to the ground. And you can see this black ground wire here is connecting this to this ground over here. Then this and this are tied together. And then same thing over here, that this is tied over to this center ground. So finally, we need to create a voltage divider going to the grid of the upper triode. And that's where we have this 680 ohm resistor that comes from the voltage after this filter network, which again we're going to have another cap sitting just like that there. And then the 680 ohm goes over here to the grid of the upper triode, and then it's then grounded from this grid over to this ground point with a 200K resistor. So we got a 680K and a 200K. And that will end up with about 95 volts sitting on this screen. And then we have this 0.22 UF film cap going from the grid to the ground. And we need to add these parts over here, obviously, to here. This is going to be from here to there will be a 680K, then a 200K goes from here to there, and then we'll put the film cap across there as well. And then the signal and ground will hook up here with a shielded wire that comes over to the volume control. Same thing here. We're going to have the signal, ground, comes over here to the volume control. And I think this layout turned out really nice and compact. It gets the signal away from these parts over here, this filter and stuff, and gives a nice place to hook up our shielded wiring that goes to the input jacks or the volume control, however you're going to wire that up. And then we have, again, like I said, the B plus just connects to here and here. And then finally, you're going to have the coupling cap that comes from the plate of the upper triode over to the grid of the output tube. So just a little short path. Cap will sit right here. Coupling cap going over to the grid of the output tube, and then the same thing over on this side. You'll have a coupling cap that goes from here to here. And the little cap will just sit right there. And guys, this is just such a cleaner layout than the earlier version of this amp. Let me get that amp over here and let me show you what it looks like. And I think you'll agree this is just a lot cleaner layout. So this is the first version of my 300B amp. And I think you'll agree the new version is just a lot cleaner layout. We've got these caps were really oversized, and it made it pretty rough on the rectifier tube. It required the use of a pretty stout new old stock rectifier. These were, I think, 200 UF or 250 UF caps, and that's like 500 UF of capacitance, which then is after this 100 UF cap and this 33 UF cap. And we had these two chokes instead of the 50 ohm resistors that we used in the new version. But we were able to move both these caps to sit over here between the transformers, which got them closer to where they're actually connected. And then this looks very similar, the same kind of layout with the resistor sitting on top of the amp using this tag strip. We were using these 100 ohm potentiometers, which, like I said, they end up running in the center. So there was really no point in having the expense and just having that extra thing to mess with. So we moved the 5 volt regulators over here, from there to there. We put the little tag strip here for the virtual center tap for the cathode, the 250 ohm wire round resistors, which then connected via short wire over to here instead of having this longer wire. And then over here, this was just kind of a hot mess. The grid stopper was just soldered in line with the lead for the cap, which isn't ideal. And the same thing with these grid leak resistors. And so we connected all this stuff on a little tag strip on this bolt this time. Let me zoom in here so I can see better what I'm talking about. You can see that the grid stopper was just in line with the coupling cap, and the same thing with the grid leak resistor. And instead we put a little tag strip here under this bolt to connect all of this stuff a lot neater. And then the ground here is just, you can see there's a zillion things soldered to this ground here. And then we ended up with multiple ground points on this one tag strip, and everything was just really crowded together. On the new version, we've moved this tube away from the front edge a little bit to give us a little more room in the front, and that allowed us to have two tag strips, one across here and then the one up here that had the signal wires, which is this stuff, which you can see is connecting down on this end. And I just really like this new layout so much better. And you can see how this cap is just kind of in a weird place. And the other thing I'm sure you notice is got just a whole kind of hodgepodge of different kinds of resistors. And I'm really trying to standardize the resistors that I'm using, because I found that they really do impact the sound. And so anyway, I think you'll agree with me that this new layout is much cleaner. Plus, the other thing that I did on this amp, which was it was almost ridiculous now that I think about it. If you look at the grounds over here, I had ground wires running just all over the amp. And I didn't really understand the concept of star grounding as well as I do now. At this point, I felt like that every individual component's ground needed to be run with its own wire back here to this ground point. And there's probably a dozen ground wires over here. And I realized that you can daisy chain some of the grounding if you do it in the correct order. And I do like to keep the ground for the output tube section separate from the ground for the input tube section, which we've done. But there really was no need for this maze of ground wiring. And so I think this new amp will be a lot easier to build. I'm kind of just doing an overview in these two videos. When I get ready to build the actual standard 300B amp that's going to be the base model 300B, I'll go step by step and show you building it so that you can follow along and build one exactly like it. But this was more just walking you through the thought process on why I changed all the way this all was wired up. And I'm pretty sure eventually I'm going to tear most of this out and rewire it like my new version is, because I think it's just a lot cleaner layout. So anyway, like I said, this wasn't meant to be like a build video. This was more of a informational video on how I figure out how to lay out components. And I mean, this amp works nice and it sounds good, but it's just really complicated, and I think overcomplicated for what it needs to be. So this looks like a great place to wrap up this video. Well, hopefully you can appreciate how much cleaner and simpler this wiring is than the original one, and how much shorter the signal path is. It just, parts are where they should be. They're near the things that need them, and it just really makes things a lot easier to build, especially if I'm going to try to build these. I mean, I know I call it production. If I'm going to build 2 or 3 of these a month, or 2 or 3 amps a month or whatever, that they're not overly complicated where it isn't just a monster time sink. Plus, I enjoy making YouTube content for you guys, so I got to work that in. So anyway, the front end wiring turned out great. I still got to hook up the speaker jacks, the RCA jacks, and run the signal wiring up to the volume control and get it installed in the front. But I think the layout for the wiring on the front end tubes turned out awesome. And I need to wire up my little meter here for the output tubes and get the final little wiring done. But we're really close to having this thing ready to go listen to and put on the Analog Discovery 2. And I do want to compare the 2 amps on the Analog Discovery 2, make sure that we're not giving up anything. Possibly we're going to have even better sound out of this one, since the signal path's shorter. We're using silver wire, and we're using consistent resistors throughout the whole amp. And we're basically using the same capacitor layouts and types that we used in the original. So this is going to be fun to see what this turns out like. And like I said earlier in this video, the last one, from here over is going to be the basis of my base model 300B that I'm going to be building. And once I standardize the use of this musical power supplies power transformer, we can get rid of this extra filament transformer inside the amp, and that's going to simplify the wiring. We'll be able to move this choke back here in the back where it's away from the AC switch more, which I don't think is a big deal, but just theoretically it is, and that sort of thing, and just make it easier to build an amplifier for you guys. So hope you're enjoying this. I know I am. I'm excited to go hear what this thing sounds like once I get it done. And I'm sure the customer is going to be excited to get it too. He's been very patient. Thank you. And once I get this done, I've got some other projects lined up that I got to get taken care of. I've got the Ultimate 300B. I've got two different woodworkers kind of competing against each other to see which one can build a chassis that I like the best. And going to work with this one guy about getting some CAD work done to be able to laser cut out the top plates and the bottom plates for those Ultimate amps, which will simplify just like the fab work for these chassis. This is actually one of my OG Hammonds that I still have. I got about 3 more of these to build, and then I'm going to transition to my new fab shop made ones that were done here locally. But they're identical, except I don't have to do as much fab work, which is nice. So anyway, hope you're enjoying this content. If you are, please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. And we will see you on the next build series. Have a nice day.